today's 70th In honor of today's 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention, we will be discussing the presidential determination of 2022 and the current status of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. Today's webinar will cover the mobilization of national partners, refugee leaders, and local organizations, and prepare you with tools for the upcoming August recess and resources how you can take urgent action for the 2022 presidential determination. Now, to provide some political context, since President Biden's day on the campaign trail, he has cast himself as welcoming refugees and those seeking asylum into the United States. Within 2 weeks of taking office, Biden signed an executive order to rebuild and enhance federal programs to resettle refugees that he said had been badly damaged under the previous administration. In February, Biden announced he was raising the annual cap on refugee admissions to 125,000 for the fiscal year that starts October 1st, up from Trump's historically low limit of 15,000. While the announcement was well received in the resettlement community, unfortunately, no action was taken. After pressure from advocate groups and receiving backlash on May 3rd, President Biden reversed himself and said he would allow as many as 62,500 refugees to enter the United States during the next 6 months for the fiscal year 2021. However, at the end of the tail end of 2021 fiscal year, the United States has only resettled about 5,769 refugees and 3,323 SIVs. This is lower than the refugee admissions during the previous administration. This is why we are urging the Biden administration to not only raise the refugee cap to 125,000, but also allow 125,000 to be processed and resettled. In addition, we are urging the Biden administration to end Title 42 around asylum and to urgently allow our Afghan SIV allies to be evacuated safely from harm's way. That being said, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Jenny Yang, who is the Vice President for Advocacy and Policy of World Relief, to talk further about the upcoming presidential determination and August recess. Welcome, Jenny, and I'm passing it on to you. Jenny, are you on the line? I don't believe we hear you. Jenny, are you on the line? We can't hear you if you are. Okay, so we will come back to Jenny. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit about your section?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, well, it's great to see so many familiar names and faces in the audience today, and thank you all for joining us as we gear up somehow already again for PD advocacy for this fall. So what I'm about to share are 5 tips on messaging about building back the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. And this is a resource that we're going to distribute to you all after our webinar wraps. But I just wanted to have the chance to talk it through with you all and of course answer questions later today. The messaging guidance that I'm about to share with you is based on 2 years of research that the Refugee Advocacy Lab has been doing with the Open Society Policy Center and a firm called Goodwin Simon Strategic Research. It's included focus group testing, national surveys, and more to really see how to build support for increased refugee resettlement here in the United States. And it's really catered, this messaging guidance is really catered toward a persuasion audience, people who might not be familiar with refugee issues, maybe don't have their minds made up, but this is a way to access those folks and bring them along that ladder of support for increased refugee resettlement. So number 1 is talk about the number without talking about the number. And what that means is the numbers surrounding the refugee resettlement cap lack context for a lot of people in the United States who are not directly involved in this work or who aren't themselves refugees or former refugees. An indication we've found of an increase in the refugee admissions cap can trigger some scarcity thinking for people, especially in the context of COVID and the difficult year and a half that we've all had together. But many people want this country to live up to its promise of being a beacon of freedom and hope for people fleeing persecution. So we found that it's more powerful to message rather than talking about numbers or increases to this persuasion audience, a focus on the importance of the United States returning to its aspirations as being a global leader, a place of welcome, a place of safety, and a place of freedom. It's also important to let people know that the last presidential administration drastically cut the US refugee resettlement program. That's important context to build in. And that building it back now would help us get back to a level of welcome that we've had in the past. And so some of the ways that you can message that is saying something like, the United States has had a long tradition of being a beacon of hope and freedom to people around the world. The last administration made drastic cuts to the resettlement program, and we need to uphold our values by restoring welcome in this country. So that's tip number one, talk about the number without talking about the number. Number two is to feature a wide range of messengers when you're talking about PD advocacy, but primarily the most powerful messengers are refugees themselves. So refugees who have built their lives here can be very effective messengers, and we're sharing the stage with a lot of those folks here today in building support for refugee inclusion. It's particularly powerful when refugees share personal narratives that include specific details about their experience of coming to the United States that fill some of the audience's knowledge gaps about refugee policy and programs. It's helpful to include information about the system that's in place before people come to the United States, a review of, application materials, background checks, et cetera, and all the measures that are taken to ensure that people who come here meet requirements for resettlement and are going to be great members of our communities, as we all well know. It's also really important to share details about needing and receiving short-term help getting resettled here, what communities did to rally support and welcome refugees in their first few days in the United States, what it was like to meet neighbors, make friends, get your first job, start school, and get involved in your new community, maybe becoming a sport coach or being a part of a faith community. Those are really things that people can kind of identify with. Audiences also really want to hear not just about a refugee fleeing from persecution and arriving in the United States, but also what their lives are like several years later, and really seeing what folks are doing in our communities now. A lot of people don't know people who are refugees and cannot readily identify with the experience of fleeing danger or persecution. But incorporating these shared values and these shared experiences can provide through your testimony a way for people to empathize and identify with people who came here to the United States as refugees. And some of those other values that you can highlight here are family, safety, determination, contribution, faith, and resilience. Some of the other non-refugee messengers, and as a person who's a native-born American, I feel a great deal of responsibility to speak out about the need for refugee inclusion. So these messengers are really important as well, and I think have a great deal of responsibility to speak out and do the work of welcoming. Some of those other effective messengers can include veterans, maybe who served alongside SIV, folks who came here through the SIV programs, employers who hire and train refugees, and people in faith-based and other community organizations who help families resettle here. So consider pairing these messengers with people who are refugees to talk about their experience, getting to know each other. And we have a great quote that was in the Bucks County Courier Times from a refugee called Samu Sacker. Said, I was 3 months into my first semester of college, working hard and dreaming about a bright future when civil war broke out. I witnessed unspeakable violence and walked a harrowing 200 miles on foot to Sierra Leone. Despite this trauma, the generosity and welcome I received in America proved that new beginnings are possible. So taking people on that story arc is really important in filling in some of those gaps. Number 3 is make sure you acknowledge the challenges of the moment when you're talking about the increase of refugee admissions to the United States. Show your audience that you understand the collective challenges that we're facing right now as a nation amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, increasing polarization and economic strife that people are experiencing. And so demonstrate that the policy proposals that you're advocating for do reflect the challenges of the moment. And you can kind of do that by saying something like, during the COVID-19 pandemic, an estimated 70% of resettled refugees in the United States were essential workers who are helping their communities on the front line of the COVID-19 response. This is a way to combat some of that scarcity thinking that comes through when people think about welcoming more people to the United States, as people are feeling a lot of the pain still of the pandemic. So number 4 is share the ways, and this is exactly building off of that, share ways that refugees contribute to our communities. We want to show that people who resettle to the United States contribute to communities in ways large and small. There's some flawed mental templates that people have, that when people fleeing persecution come here, that they might be taking rather than giving. And we want to unmake that flawed mental template and show that refugees contribute to their communities in ways large and small, through sharing their skills, their expertise, their training, their neighborliness, volunteering, and their talents to strengthen our communities. So a way that we've talked about this is highlighting a study that I'm sure you're all familiar with from the Department of Health and Human Services that showed that from 2005 to 2014, refugees contributed $63 billion more in taxes than the cost of the support they received as they resettled. And so that's something that we found has been really powerful to show people how much refugees contribute when they resettle and are able to rebuild their lives here in the United States. Finally, it's really important to proactively fill in knowledge gaps. A typical person doesn't have a full understanding of the process and policies around refugee resettlement in the United States, let alone understand the difference between a refugee and an immigrant. So it's important to fill some of those critical knowledge gaps that help kind of calm audience concerns and enable them to connect with this issue, to values they want to see reflected in the United States as a welcoming nation. And it's especially helpful, we found, to emphasize that there is a system in place for bringing refugees to the United States. We heard in some of our focus groups a refrain that, there's not a system. And I think when I first came into this field as a communications professional, there was some prevailing wisdom that you didn't want to talk about the system that's in place for security vetting and screening for refugees before they came to the United States, because it was sort of like, saying, don't think about the pink elephant, that suggesting that there was even a process to screen for security could get people thinking in their minds that there was a risk involved in bringing people here. And so there was some prevailing wisdom for a long time that that was only something that you would sort of react to or explain, but not proactively message about. And we found that it's a big knowledge gap for people, and they are so reassured when they know that there is this great system in place that brings people in need here to the United States to restart their lives. So let them know that there was a system and a vetting process. Let them know that there's support for refugees when their families arrive. That we connect refugees to local organizations to assist them in rebuilding their lives. And so that we found is really important too. So just to briefly recap, and like I said, I'm going to send this out to everyone who attended here today. Talk about the number without talking about the number. Feature a wide range of messengers on these issues, but primarily refugees themselves are the most powerful messengers to reach this persuasion audience. Acknowledge the challenges of the moment in all of your messaging. share ways that refugees contribute to their communities, and finally, proactively fill in some of those knowledge gaps. And like I said, happy to answer any questions at the end of our session, and happy to share this resource guide with you all as we're thinking about our PD advocacy and messaging. One more thing that I just wanted to mention, and then I will turn it back to Nara, is that the Refugee Advocacy Lab is taking on a project that IRAP has traditionally taken on in years past to organize a letter from state and local elected officials in support of the presidential determination and an increase in refugee resettlement that will be sent to the president. And we're working on those materials right now. The letter itself is going to go live on August 5th. There's going to be a September 15th deadline for officials to sign on. And we're going to be providing a bunch of materials. We're building a microsite right now, welcomingrefugees2022.com, I think, .org. And we will be sharing that out with you as well as a bunch of materials, including a call script if you want to call your local representative and ask them to sign on, an email script to ask your local electeds to sign on, some social media if you want to tag your elected officials to ask them to sign this letter, and just some more to make this as easy as possible. So looking forward to sharing that with you all on August 5th when that launches. So please look out for that, and we would love to just get as much support as possible on that letter to show that there is a robust show of support across the country for refugees. And then finally, just a call for 3 to 4 stories that we're looking for on a theme of community welcome that we want to highlight alongside these materials. So if there's something that's already published, an op-ed about the experience that a refugee had being welcomed, an experience that you had welcoming refugees into your community, please do reach out to me and share that, because we want to uplift some of these stories on this theme of community welcome alongside this letter. So Nara, I'll pass it back to you. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, you're fine. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the comms messaging strategies, and also I think with the letter for elected officials, I can't speak today. It would be really helpful if you all on the call can help support that and have us all work on it together to make sure we get as many signatures as possible. So thank you, Sarah, for providing that information to us. And now I'm going to pass it back to Jenny Yang, who wasn't able to join us right away, but she is going to provide a little bit more context what's going on with the presidential determination this year and also the August recess. So Jenny, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's really great to be with you, and I look forward to the conversation today just around the refugee ceiling and just some of the latest refugee policy updates. So I oversee all the advocacy and policy work for World Relief. We are one of the resettlement agencies in the United States. And so I'm also co-chair of the Refugee Council USA Advocacy Committee. And so this update is really just to empower you all as we enter into August, which we know is an important month, because this is the month that all members of Congress are actually back in their states and back in their districts. And it's a really key opportunity for us to reach out to our members and our representatives with our asks around refugee issues, and to make sure that they prioritize refugee issues, especially now when I think with a new administration and a new president, we really do have a really good political opportunity to weigh in and make sure that the president and others support refugees. And so I wanted to give a little bit of an update in terms of what is actually happening with refugee resettlement, and then also talk to you about 3 specific priorities we have as an advocacy community around some specific advocacy asks. And then I'll end with just sharing with you all just specific things we as a community can do to make sure that we are highlighting these refugee asks for our community. So just an update on the refugee ceiling. So you can go to the next slide. So we all know that earlier this year that the president actually increased the refugee ceiling from the historic low of 15,000 to 62,500. And actually what was interesting is that he did not do this immediately. In fact, it took a lot of public pressure and a lot of advocacy for the president to even raise the ceiling to what he had promised which was 62,500. And so this was, towards the end of the fiscal year, and we're very glad that the president raised the ceiling. But at the same time, we know that the program was so decimated that it really needed a lot of resources and infrastructure rebuild to make sure that we can actually reach the 62,500. So at the end of June, our current arrivals numbers is a little bit less than 5,000. And I think we're right at 5,000 or a little above it now that we're nearing the end of July. But what we know is that we're nowhere near the numbers that we want to be at to reach the ceiling of 62,500. I think for right now, we still need to continue to send a message that this rebuild of the refugee resettlement program is very important, and it's going to require a lot of continued resources and political commitment from the president and members of Congress to make sure that we can reach the ceiling of 62,500. The 62,500 was really the first step, but we need continued action from the White House to make sure that we can reach the actual ceiling that is set. The other thing to mention, though, is that even as the refugee ceiling was increased, that we actually want to see a higher refugee ceiling for next fiscal year, which is FY22. And so our main ask for, if you go to the next slide, is actually that the president will raise the refugee ceiling to 125,000 for next fiscal year. And the reason why this is important is because the president himself actually committed to raising the ceiling to this number when he was on the campaign trail, and actually when he was elected president as well. So we have to hold his feet to the fire and actually make sure that he does what he said that he would do. And the reason why this is also important is because we know that we can resettle that number, that we have the capacity to resettle that number, and that our communities of welcome are ready and willing to assist refugees when they get to the United States. We know that it's going to take a lot of work for us to even get to the place of resettling 125, but we can't start unless we have that goal to aspire to reach 125,000 refugees in the United States. And so we are, I think all of our communities have a voice, and just over this recess of responsibility to make this our main ask for the administration. And we do not want President Biden to get cold feet like he's gotten cold feet in the first few months of the administration. We want to make sure that he knows and is aware that there is a lot of communities in the US from across the country that support refugees and that support us being able to resettle a higher number than we traditionally have had over the past several months. So that is the main ask that we are having of the president in this August. And the reason why it's so important that we do it now is because August is actually the critical month at which point the State Department is going to determine the number. And so the State Department will actually have what's called a report to Congress. Well, they'll actually have a recommendation for the number, and they are right now writing that report. And based on that report, they will actually submit that to Congress, and the Secretary of State then will consult with members of Congress in August or in September about that number. And so normally what they'll do is they'll either say that they like the number, they won't like the number, and then it'll be a process of open discussion where members of Congress can actually influence what the White House ultimately decides as the refugee ceiling. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll actually see there some information about what the congressional consultations have been. And traditionally, the judiciary committees from the Senate and the House side are the ones that are in charge of facilitating the consultations. And so you'll see here, there's a list of members of Congress, both on the Senate and House, that have traditionally participated in the refugee consultations. And so this is continues to be the list that we're gonna use to reach out. And so if you see on this list, your senator or your representative, know that they play an extremely important role in the refugee consultations. And so please do reach out to them if you see them on this list, because they are going to be part of the refugee consultations in the next few months. And then the following slide, you'll also see just information about how to reach out to your member of Congress. And so if your member is not on the committee, they still have an important role to play in actually weighing in with the White House on the refugee number. And so if you haven't contacted your member before, it's very easy to do. You can actually go to usa.gov and then punch in your address, and then it'll actually pop up the information for you in terms of who your member of Congress is. And so I guess by show of hands, can you raise your hand if you have ever called your member of Congress before?
Or input in the chat.
Yeah, or you can input in the chat. Okay, so a lot of you have, which is amazing. And I know you all are very engaged and active members of your community, so it's really great to see. And so I think the main thing to know about our members is that it is their job to work for us, because they're elected into office and they are basically working for us. And so when they go to DC, they have a lot of things that they are responsible for. But our job as refugee advocates is to make sure that they prioritize refugee issues. And oftentimes members will not prioritize refugee issues unless they hear from us that this is an issue that they should care about. So the refugee ceiling, making sure that it's raised to $125,000 for next fiscal year is critically important, especially during this month and next month, where they're going to actually decide the number and consult with members of Congress. And so actually, before I go on to the next slide, which talks about our second ask, which is around the Afghan evacuation, are there any questions that you all have around the refugee ceiling or the PD that you want to ask me before I move on to the next topic?
Jenny, we're going to leave questions for the end. That way, folks,
okay.
That way we have everyone, all of our speakers able to get through, and then we'll have Q&A session at the end.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. So the next topic that I'd like to talk about is just the Afghan evacuation. So this is our second main ask. So the first ask is raise the refugee ceiling to 125,000, but the second is that the United States has to have a plan to evacuate vulnerable Afghans. Right now, there are around 18,000 Afghans that have actually applied to be a special immigrant visa holder to come into the United States. And the US government recently announced that they are planning to evacuate roughly 2,500 of these individuals, and that these individuals will be evacuated to Fort Lee, Virginia, to a military base. But it still leaves behind around 15,000 Afghans who we believe are extremely vulnerable and really have no pathway to the United States. And so our main ask is that the US government evacuate all the 18,000 Afghans, not just the smaller number of 2,500, and that they really accelerate other pathways of protection for vulnerable Afghans. As Refugee Council USA, one of the asks that we've had is to really facilitate family reunification for family members. And so we at World Relief, for example, have 20 Afghan families that are waiting for their family members overseas. And we want to make sure that the administration facilitates the expedited processing of these individuals. So this has been our second ask for the administration to make sure that they can evacuate vulnerable Afghans. And then the last third policy ask that I want to talk briefly about is just our asylum protection asks. So you'll see on the next slide that we've had continuing concerns about the ability for individuals in the from overseas to access asylum in the United States. And still in place right now is a policy called Title 42, which basically has meant that a lot of individuals who are trying to find asylum in the United States has not been able to because of this public health rule that has actually prevented them from being able to enter the United States. And so one of the main asks that we've had is that the US government end Title 42 and actually allow vulnerable asylum seekers to find safety in the United States. The administration has given some indication that they are going to repeal the rule, Title 42, but because of recent spikes in the COVID and other concerns, that they have not rescinded fully Title 42 yet. And so these are our three asks, is the refugee ceiling, raising it to 125,000, is making sure to evacuate all 18,000 Afghans and others who are vulnerable, and also to expanding asylum protections in the United States. And so there's a lot of things you can do through the August recess. If you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the main things that we want refugee advocates and others to do is to make sure that you voice your concerns to your members of Congress when they're in district. And so if you haven't already, scheduling a meeting with your member of Congress, making congressional calls, placing an op-ed piece in a local paper, and even elevating support for refugee issues through social media and tagging your member of Congress is a great way to just get attention to the issues that we care about. Next week, we will have finalized an August congressional toolkit, which we will send to you. And this toolkit will have everything you need to know to do these congressional actions during advocacy during August. It'll have a template letter. It'll have scripts that you can use to call your member of Congress. It also has talking points, sample op-eds. So it has really everything you will need to do these advocacy actions in the month of August. And so I just wanted to end by sharing with you just a few photos to motivate and inspire you of why advocacy is so important and the successes that we've had actually. And so you'll see on the next slide that there is, and this is some information about contacting your elected official. You can go to the next, I think the next two slides. Yeah. So this is the slide from a few years ago that actually a refugee delegation from Arizona met with a local member of Congress and was able to have some Hill visits. And so if you are a refugee, your story is the most powerful part of your advocacy. And so when you reach out to your member of Congress, please share your stories with them. And when you share your story personally with a member, it can literally change their lives. And so please don't be shy. And I think all of your stories can have such power in being able to express support for refugees. And then the second slide I just want to show you is just engagement with members of Congress. If you don't follow RCUSA_DC, please do so, because this is the community that is building up campaigns, and you can follow them and retweet them. And also there are members of Congress that are doing great things. And as those tweets come out, please do support these members as well. And just the last slide, well, actually, I think that is the last slide. And so, yeah, I think these are just all great ways for everyone to take action. And again, your voice and your stories are going to be the most important part of your engagement. And I just look forward to answering your questions and engaging in a conversation with you later in this call. So thanks so much for having me. And I look forward to getting to know you all in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for all that information. So now you all have a little bit of a context around advocacy work that's happening nationally across the country. Also, Sarah was able to share some information around strategic comms and the local elected official letter that's going to be coming out next week. And now we're going to turn it a little bit to a different context, which is we're going to turn it to what is happening at the local and state level. So I am going to introduce my colleague, Sylvia Nyamahungu, who is a CWS organizer in Michigan. Sylvia is going to talk about actions that they have been taking in Michigan around the presidential determination. And after Sylvia, we'll have two other local organizers share what they're doing or what they have done in the past. So Sylvia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nara, for the opportunity. I'm very honored to share a little bit around the work that we have been doing here in Michigan. Like Nara shared, my names are Sylvia Nyamuhungu. I was born as a refugee from Rwanda and was raised in Kenya. My family spent 17 years as refugees, and we were finally resettled in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to be specific, on the year 2011. Right now, I have the honor of working as a community organizer for refugees through Church World Service and Bethany Christian Services. Very, very encouraged by organizations like Church World Service and We All America that give the platforms for refugees to be involved in advocating for themselves and advocating for issues affecting us. Since the previous administration got into power, it was heartbreaking to see the refugee ceiling reduced each year. And on October 28th, 2020, President Trump, as you know, issued the presidential determination setting the fiscal year 2021 refugee ceiling at 15,000. This was the lowest refugee ceiling we have seen in years in the US refugee admissions program. This was a time more than ever that our voices as refugees needed to be amplified, a time that as refugees needed to take up the space to fight for our lives, to fight for the lives of our loved ones who are still in refugee camps, and for refugees all over the world. Here in Michigan, we started to mobilize refugees to get out to vote last year during the presidential election period, and hoping to influence the change of the PD that was at that time 15,000. Refugees have been living in the US for years and have had the capacity to vote and been able to influence leadership. We understood that it was really, really important for us refugees to go out and vote for our leaders that valued our lives and the lives of refugees all over the world. So we organized, we hosted voters engagement workshops. At these workshops, we invited refugees to learn about the federal and local governing structures and also how to vote. We organized, we did phone bankings. We spent hours calling individuals all over the state using a system that helped us target refugees and immigrants, asking them if they needed any help in voting and reminding them to go out and vote. We also created videos. We created interpreted videos. These videos were short videos that talked about how to register to vote and also how to vote, and in multiple languages. It was very encouraging to see former refugees coming in the community and being part of this work, participating in helping with phone banking, participating in helping creating these videos in the languages they spoke. And also just attending workshops, helping plan the workshops as well about how to vote and how to pick a candidate and all that. We did all this to make sure that our voices as refugees living in the United States were heard, and that we participated in voting for leaders who aligned with our values. And then in November 2020, last year, we organized in our communities and produced a West Michigan Faith and Community Leader Letter. This was after President Trump came to West Michigan at that time in November, and it was one of his last campaign stops. And he made some unfortunately untrue comments about refugees and immigrants. And then we ended up reaching out to different leaders and communities and asked them to sign on this letter. This letter showed that the remarks that President Trump made at that time were not true, and that Michigan communities and organizations have a long history and have been united by values of loving their neighbors and welcoming those fleeing persecution. And that Michigan was ready to receive and welcome refugees from all over the world. This letter that we organized had over 145 signatures from faith and community leaders. This letter was then published and then was shared by to Michigan medias and also received by the Biden's transition team. In April this year, April 2021, before our current president had officially increased the PD to what we have right now of refugees, we partnered with RCUSA and organized legislative visits. We met with multiple elected officials, including 2 of our main senators. At these visits, we refugees were present to bring light to our existence here in Michigan, and also urged our elected officials to keep the administration accountable to raising the refugee PD as they had promised. Now we continue to organize, we continue to find ways to keep our administration accountable and advocate for refugees. We have opportunities like the August recess that's coming up. We hope to plan more visits with our elected officials to make sure that they keep the administration accountable towards increasing the PD for FY 2022 and that they continue to serve us. So that's some of the things we've been doing around the PD, and there's so much more opportunities. We're very excited with how things have been changing, but also are very, very hopeful for the future. Thank you so much, Nair, for the opportunity, and everyone else for attending this webinar session.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for all the information and for all the work that you are doing in Michigan with local communities. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kayo Bashir, who is a refugee leader and grassroots organizer worked in Tennessee. He's going to talk about the organizing work he has done. Kayo, I turn it over to you.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? I appreciate you, Naira. It's so beautiful seeing everybody on here. Thank you. Also, Sylvia, I think we're doing a lot of similar work. So yeah, my name is Kayo Bashir. Myself, I'm from Oromia, but seek refuge in Kenya, lived in Uganda, and then came to the States when I was around 11 and 12. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, especially going back to the previous administration, and then specifically here in Tennessee. As you guys remember, 2016, the Tennessee legislature decided to sue the federal government in an effort to end the refugee resettlement. They pretty much, claim that the federal government is forcing states to cover the cost of refugee resettlement while violating the 10th Amendment. By filing this lawsuit, the state legislature pretty much was jeopardizing the resettlement program itself, and potentially setting a dangerous precedence for the communities and refugee communities across the country. So this is the part of the role that Tennessee played around PD and other determinations that would go afterwards to impact refugees. So I believe Tennessee played a huge role in this. And so if you remember in 2019, not only was the PD numbers decreased, there was also an executive order allowing governors to choose to resettle refugees or not. They also gave localities power to choose if they wanted to resettle refugees. So this was very tough back in 2019. But I think our biggest goal at the time was to create this strong outcry against the executive order and attempting to give states these powers. So first, we had to refuse it and we would not accept it. Of course, within the organization, we did a lot of e-blasts, multi-city rapid response, refugee op-eds, the normal typical. But I think for me, most important were the refugee summits that we did. What we did were refugee summits across the state where, we were going out to different communities and doing advocacy trainings and informing communities about what this PD meant, and a lot of our community members, as we found out, did not know half of this was going on. So engaging community members from the beginning, doing a lot of power mapping. I think, within that, we were able to not only engage communities, but also identify new leaders, identify people to join our work instead of Turk as an organization doing it themselves. We were able to engage folks from the beginning. So I think, that was very powerful for me. And within that, we had community members start off as volunteers and then come on and do some paid work for us. We had individuals join us and now are part of our board membership, so I think seeing all of that was really beautiful. And I think I really want to emphasize Sarah's point earlier about engaging folks from the beginning, especially those impacted, because at the end we saw Governor Lee being one of the first governors to accept refugees. And then as far as 2020 goes in 2021, I think, of course, like everybody else, we engaged our communities during election time. And then, letter signing and continuing refugee organizing. One of my coworkers is on here that's doing some great work within canvassing around refugee resettlement. And I think we've seen a lot of work around that. So that has been really powerful. And then we got about 3 main cities to sign a resolution that saying they're gonna continue to, support refugees come 2021. So yeah, that's a little summary about all the work that we did, but really wanted to just emphasize engaging our community members and those impacted from the beginning. And I'll pass it back off to you, Naira.
Thank you so much, Kayo. Thank you for all of the amazing work that you are doing and have been doing over the years. I also want to turn it over to Aisha Hassan, who is a Texas grassroots organizer with CWS. And Aisha is going to talk a little bit more about the organizing work around the PD that's happening in Texas. So Aisha, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nara, and thank you so much to Sylvia and Kaio for sharing, what you're doing on the ground in your states. I think we're running a little behind on time, so I'm not going to dive into the specific work we're doing here in Texas because it's very similar to things that Kaio and Sylvia had gone through. But what I'm instead going to do is pivot a little bit to providing some tangible tips and things to consider when meeting with your elected leaders, because as Jenny and mentioned, in-district meetings are going to be one of the best actions that you can take during this August recess to advocate for refugees. So the first thing that I want to bring up is always making sure that you are having a preparation session before you're actually going into those legislative meetings. So everybody who is going to your legislative meeting, along with your elected leaders, should meet beforehand and be aware that you may only have a maximum of 15 minutes to actually meet with your member of Congress or assigned staffer. So people from your team need to remember to be direct and concise with their messaging to make sure that they can, get the most potent time spent during those 15 minutes. Another tip, which is something that Sarah actually focused on a little bit as well, is making sure that we're centering the voices of refugees and immigrants in our meetings. Another tip that goes hand in hand with this is assigning speaker roles and an order in which people are going to speak in your legislative meeting. So this will allow for less confusion and allow people to know who to speak when. Now, the reason we're asking folks to center refugee and immigrant voices is because they have the most powerful voice and they're the ones directly impacted in this experience. However, I want to bring up the fact that folks should not just resign refugees and immigrants to the role of storyteller. You should be empowering refugees and immigrants to make the advocacy asks in these meetings and play more active roles in the meetings as well. My last tip for folks that you can take home when considering meeting with your members of Congress is to make sure that you follow up. Don't treat this in-district meeting as a one and done deal. Always send a follow-up email with any handouts you've been provided by your local organizer or resettlement agency and provide answers to any questions you may have been unable to answer during the meeting. Another thing to remember is, like Sarah said, that there is strength in the diversity of advocates. So bring with you veterans, faith leaders, business owners. It's wonderful to have a diversity of folks in the room when you're advocating for refugees. Remember as well, like Jenny said, that you are the person that your member of Congress answers to. So it's incredibly important to build that relationship with your member of Congress. And you can do this by inviting your member of Congress or their staff to upcoming events after you attend that in-district meeting. So think about open house events that you're having at your local resettlement agency or at your place of worship. Make sure that you're creating opportunities to further that relationship with your member of Congress, because the more you engage with your member of Congress, the more responsive they will be to addressing your needs as a constituent. I hope that these were some good tangible tips for you all to take with you as we enter into August recess. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you all today, and thank you so much, Nara, for the time.
Thank you so much, Aisha. That was really helpful. And thank you to all of our organizers for sharing your experiences in your states and what has worked. I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Andres Bautista, who is our Asylum Digital Organizer with We Are All America. Andres is going to spend just a minute or two to talk about the digital toolkit and the Refugee Matters series. So Andres, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Let me change the slide real quick. Awesome. A quick overview about the digital toolkit. So this digital toolkit is being put together by national partners, and it's going to include talking points, sample captions, and graphics. It's also going to be a way for folks to get involved. I would keep an eye out for that next week around August 3rd. In addition, as Nada mentioned, the Refugee Matters series, we'll be launching that on August 11th and on the 18th as well. It's going to be part of a larger content calendar with weekly highlights for August leading up to the presidential determination. So on our first 2 weeks, we're going to focus on the August recess and on the presidential determination. And then on the second week of August 16th and August 23rd, we'll be focusing on asylum. Furthermore, something to keep in mind is we will also be hosting a border roundtable where we will be welcoming experts on the ground to discuss the challenges and solutions that will be explored with the asylum process in border states such as Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. We're going to be featuring a variety of diverse voices from individuals with lived experiences, shelter caseworkers, and more. I will be sending out that Zoom link as well in the chat soon. Lastly, the week of August 30th to September 16th, we're going to be focusing on Afghan SIVs. So these are all going to be items that will be uploaded on social. So this is an opportunity to uplift the toolkit, the social media events, and other events such as the Border Roundtable. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. I will be dropping my email in the chat as well. And if you're interested in getting involved, feel free to contact me directly.
Thank you, Andres. So that toolkit will be going out next week, and we will share that with you all once it's finalized. And before we wrap up the webinar, I just would like to open it up for maybe 1 or 2 questions. So if you have a question, put it in the chat box right now, and we can have our speakers answer it for the remainder of the time. Or you can speak up. Thank you, Andres. Andres put the link for the Border Roundtable that's happening August 19th. Any questions before we wrap up? This is your opportunity.
I guess the question I have, maybe one last question, is more about the dates for the August recess. We know it might change depending on what is going on in DC. Is that correct?
Jenny, can you answer that, Jenny?
Yeah, actually, I think the August recess is pretty firm in terms of members of Congress actually going back to their districts and states. So it doesn't really affect the calendar of what we're asking for. And what we also know is that the consultations that Congress and the President and Secretary of State are supposed to have will still happen probably sometime in August or September. So it has to happen before August 1st or October 1st. And so in terms of the August recess, we don't really see anything shifting in terms of our asks. But we also know that it's urgent because they are making the decision very soon.
And Jenny, can you verify just so everyone knows when the August recess is?
Yeah, so it's soon. It's August. Well, we're going to send you all the August recess toolkit next week, but then congressional recess is actually, I believe it starts next week. And so again, the members of Congress will be back in their districts and their states. And this is really the key time when they're looking to meet with folks. And so yeah, please do reach out to them with a simple call or letter requesting a meeting, and normally they will be able to meet with you. So yeah, they're fully in session in recess starting August 9th, both the Senate and the House, and so you can reach out to them at that time.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mhm.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our speakers and all of our participants for joining us today. We will be following up via email for more information. This recording will be included in the email, and then a second follow-up email will be sent next week with the toolkit, along with that letter, the local elected official letter. If you had any other questions, put them in the chat box right now and we will follow up with you. And thank you so much. We are going to conclude the webinar.